This is a look at the V2G, H and L technologies, how they work and how they're going to impact EVs in future energy and energy prices for not just EV FEV and EV hybrid owners, but for everyone. It's 3 years since the March 2022 The Electrical Grid V2G and EV Home Charging webpage was published, and now in 2025, it's all happening. Welcome to One Finite Planet EV video on the implications of bidirectional EV and EV hybrid charging. A lot to cover, so you may jump to chapters which cover what V2L, anti-islanding, V2H and V2G all mean, the economics of solar and V2G, and then the gear, AC versus DC inverters, bidirectional charging, wall boxes, and vehicle requirements. Next, the reality check, a look at the issues for EV makers and politics, and managing future energy costs, potential impact on future energy and future vehicles. What's new? V2G's here. Australia, the country with the highest penetration of home solar, has just approved standards for vehicle to grid, which makes Australia the logical current guinea pig for technology that will roll out globally. And talking to those in the industry at Everything Electric Australia, revealed there is already a lot of international interest, and they expect it to spread quickly. Vehicle to load, or V2L, is what most EV owners know. V2L is great on occasions, but despite what it can do, it's changed life little for most EV owners. It powers the mains power points within an EV, or can be available through an adapter that plugs into the vehicle charging port and provides the ability to run mains power appliances from the car main traction battery. An inverter within the car converts DC power from the battery into mains level AC power for one or more wall sockets. I carry a coffee machine and induction hot plate to enable picnics and snacks in an EV. Others run power tools or even electric barbecues. But other than those who use it for work, few use it that often, even though it's great when you can use it. Most EVs, strangely other than Tesla, have offered V2L for some time, and it raises the question as to what more is needed to support vehicle to home. If the car can supply enough power, then why can't it do vehicle to home? Islanding is a key part of what makes using V2L as a V2Home solution during blackouts more complex than it might at first seem. This is because power connected into the home circuits can also flow back out into the local part of the grid, even during a blackout, creating an island of power that can include neighbours and potentially the part of the local grid that power workers will be trying to fix without being electrocuted. With V2L for individual appliances, it's obvious that whatever you plug into the car is not also connected to the grid, but connecting all or part of the home requires either unplugging the relevant parts of the home from the grid or activating a switch that disconnects the relevant circuits from the grid. Anti-islanding is a system that automatically prevents power going back out into the grid during a blackout, and is the first thing that must be added before turning V2L into V2H. The simplest anti-islanding simply turns off power from local solar or batteries, which may make sense for homes with home solar, given most blackouts are at night or during storms, but once you add batteries, it makes more sense to disconnect. Vehicle to home, or V2H, is more complex than V2L because unless you have an off-grid home that only has power when the car is connected, there will be the grid and or solar and maybe a home battery to consider. The end result is you could run V2H during a blackout using AC V2L, provided the house has a switch for disconnecting from the grid. But for automatically selecting the right source of power, a control unit will be needed. And if there is also home solar, even for off-grid homes, feeding the car battery power into the home circuits can become an almost identical system to a vehicle-to-grid system. In the end, vehicle-to-home is not really a separate technology, but a choice between vehicle-to-load into a house that is first temporarily manually disconnected from the grid and vehicle-to-grid. Vehicle-to-grid, or V2G, is a system using a wall box to enable the same charger connection to charge a vehicle when desired, and also, when desired, supplement or supply home power, and optionally, when desired, and the grid will pay, sell power back to the grid. Note these systems are also usually the most cost-effective solution even for off-grid homes or those who will never send power to the grid. With V2G, other than during blackouts, the home can be left connected to the grid with the wall box used to control which of these three scenarios is in play. 1. Local battery and/or solar is providing less power than the home needs, and power from the grid is either supplementing or providing all power to the home. 2. Local battery and/or solar is configured to provide exactly the power the home needs, so no power is flowing to or from the grid. 3. Local battery and/or solar is able to and configured to provide more power than the home needs, so power is flowing to the grid. Disconnecting from the grid during scenario 2 is optional, but anti-islanding capability is normally required and is normally a requirement during blackouts or other times the grid voltage falls below normal levels. At those times, without anti-islanding disconnecting from the grid, unwanted power from the home would flow to the grid. It's hard to see how V2G could work using AC power from the vehicle, as controlling power sent to the grid requires fine control of the voltage from the inverter, and in-car inverters are not configured for that type of voltage control. Without precise voltage control, the grid would either take too much power and overload the inverter or battery, or take nothing at all and still power everything. So V2G is using DC direct from the battery to the control box. The economics of home solar vary over time. In a grid with very little solar power, grid providers may even pay those with home solar to feed their excess solar power to the grid. But as the amount of solar power in the grid grows, grid operators become overloaded with power during the times when the sun is providing the most solar power. At times of peak solar output, homeowners can even be penalised for providing power to the grid. It gets worse because the rules of supply and demand mean power prices fall when the sun is shining, so the money saved by having power when the sun shines also falls. In Australia, there are already energy plans which provide free power at around midday, and demand pricing can even mean there are times when customers can be paid to consume power. The inverters of many solar systems have no capacity to control blending of their power with the grid power, so they simply send their full power to the input to the house on the basis that if it's more than the house needs, the excess will be welcomed by the grid. But at some point, if solar uptake continues, these inverters will need to be replaced with smart inverters like those from V2G systems that can choose to supply exactly the needs of the house without sending power to the grid at times when sending power to the grid would incur charges. By making power free when the sun shines and more expensive when it doesn't, grid operators can preserve revenues for homes with solar. Baseload power can mean power that cannot be scaled back and must always be consumed, and too much baseload power can be a problem if demand falls below the baseload because people have solar. The end result is if suppliers add baseload power, they want people to pay even when not using grid power. And in any event, suppliers can just shift energy prices for when solar is not available, enabling them to collect the same totals even from people with solar. As people use less from the grid, they can raise prices for what is used in order to maintain revenues, unless people don't need power at all. V2G can make sense even without having solar, because batteries can be charged up when electricity is at its lowest price and supplied back to the grid during times when the grid is struggling to meet demand. When the grid needs power, the price per kilowatt grid operators are prepared to pay to avoid needing to shut down parts of the grid can be very high. Getting dollars back from the grid is mostly about earning great rewards during a few hours each year. But I know of one V2G Nissan Leaf owner who earned over 6,000 Australian dollars in 2024, with almost 500 Australian dollars of that being just within 1 2-hour period. Ultimately, the only solution that remains economic for the consumer as more people join is having solar with a small home battery backed by a V2G EV or EV hybrid. At the prices of solar cells in 2025, anyone who can install solar should get their money back, and quite quickly. However, adding solar without providing for a home battery in V2G risks having to continually replace the unit, known as the wall box or inverter or control unit, as the system grows and the economics change. While the prices of home batteries are falling, last mile delivery and sometimes even installation costs make home batteries typically more expensive than buying an EV or EV hybrid for the value of the battery alone. Large batteries having their own transport system built in creates genuine savings. With EV hybrids, see separate video, able to cost less than an equivalent traditional combustion engine car and still being refueled with gasoline/petrol anytime charging is not desired, it's like anytime a new car is purchased, there can be an option to get an effectively free home battery as a bonus. V2G is based around the principle that electricity is inherently bidirectional, as it always flows from the point with the highest voltage to the point with the lower voltage. This means electrical circuits will by default allow the flow of power in either direction. A house consumes power from the grid because an appliance that consumes power slightly lowers the voltage at its plug, causing electricity from the grid to flow into the home and through to that plug. Have an appliance or any point on the home grid that can raise the voltage and power flows out of the home. The same with charging an EV. Whilst AC charging with an EV uses an onboard inverter, which means there's no direct connection to the battery, DC charging is a direct connection to the battery. Connected charger that supplies a slightly higher voltage than the battery and charge flows into the battery. Connector voltage below the voltage of the battery and power flows out of the battery. This means the DC connection for charging an EV can also be used for accessing power from the battery. Obviously, this needs to be done correctly, and the voltages present are lethal to humans, and correct control is required to ensure a voltage drop that results in the desired flow of current. But both ends of V2G are based around the bidirectional nature of electricity. V2G can incorporate both charging for an EV battery and use of power from an EV battery, as well as allow power to flow from the grid to the house or from the house to the grid. While current, as measured in amps, is how much power rather than the type of power, every different voltage changes the type of power, as does being DC, which is like 0 Hertz AC, or every different frequency of AC. None are interchangeable, and everything needs electrical power within its limits. Every change in voltage, or change from AC to DC or back, or between different frequencies of AC, requires circuitry to change the power into what is needed. Mostly, this is done by inverters, and if enough people indicate in comments that it's wanted, I'll create a video on inverters and link below. But going from solar to home/grid AC, and from home battery to home/grid AC, and from EV battery to home/grid AC, all require different things from an inverter. V2G units, such as those from Red Earth, are becoming available and provide one unit capable of meeting all the needs of a home system, whilst units designed for home solar, and even home solar with battery, will normally not have the capacity to handle voltages needed for V2G. Where possible, having one unit from the outset will be less expensive, and trying to get different units to work together is not really practical. Buying solar without planning for V2G will normally mean not having an inverter that can also manage V2G. So if V2G is ever added later, it will normally mean replacing a significant part of the original investment in solar. Many in Australia already have a unit that will need replacing, but for anyone looking at adding solar now, I'd recommend comparing costs with and without also having V2G. V2G units may fall in price, but they'd have to fall a lot to make not getting a unit from the outset worthwhile. So what's needed from the EV or EV hybrid? I have a separate video, which will be linked below, on EV hybrids and EV PHEVs, but to keep it simple, the following three things are required from the vehicle. 1, a DC charging port, such as CCS2, CHAdeMO or NACS, a battery with sufficient total life capacity to make V2G/V2H practical. 3, software in the vehicle which supports V2G/V2H via the DC port. The first, the DC charging port, as pictured here, is required. Some vehicles with a plug can be charged by AC only, and although they may support V2L, which can allow powering appliances during a blackout, they're not suitable for a connection to a house that is connected to the grid. Second is a battery with sufficient total life capacity, where total life is the total battery capacity multiplied by the number of cycles a battery of that type can sustain. The average home in Australia consumes 18 kilowatt hours per day, meaning the average power consumption per home is below 1 kilowatt. And in the USA, the number is just over 29 kilowatt hours, making average consumption just over 1.2 kilowatts. If the home has solar, then some power will come directly from solar. With heating and cooling being the biggest users of power, in a warm country like Australia, air conditioning during the day will typically be the biggest use of power and could be met mostly by solar. In any event, not all of the 18 kilowatt hours per day could possibly come from the battery, given batteries cannot supply power when being charged, see link below. Even half from the battery, on average, should be conservative. Batteries, now typically lasting over 3,000 cycles, particularly under the low loads that are typical for home power. How low is the load? Well, 18 kilowatt hours per day is less than 1 kilowatt hour on average. 3,000 cycles is just over 8 years of cycles if cycling once every single day. Still, I would be suggesting at least a 15 kilowatt hour LFP battery to completely avoid needing the grid. And even then, it could need replacing in around 10 years, depending on the total kilometres driven, in addition to the home use. Closer to 30 kilowatt hours, LFP would be safer for ensuring a real 20-year battery life for someone also driving beyond typical annual driving distance. Note, not just future cars, but every vehicle with a suitable battery and charging point already on the road in Australia right now should be able to support V2G with a zero-cost software upgrade, which brings us to point 3, software support from the car brand. Will EV manufacturers support it? V2G has been part of the CHAdeMO standard since 2014. Although that doesn't mean all cars are supported, most did. However, almost no one has officially declared support for V2G on the now almost universal in Australia and Europe CCS2. Almost all cars can support it, but manufacturers have to decide to update software and have to be happy the result will not increase warranty costs. If V2G is primarily used for a household's own power, then even the extra perhaps 10 kilowatts per day would be equivalent to an around extra 20 minutes of driving at 110 kilometres per hour. But doing that every day is like an extra 10,000 kilometres per year in terms of battery usage, although without any other part of the car seeing that extra wear. The simplest solution would be to have people sign up to additional warranty conditions and metrics on the battery warranty to have V2G enabled. Although for a full-size battery EV, it should be a non-issue, as even a person not only running their house but supplying as much as 25 kilowatts of power to the grid for the few hours they could be paid for supplying it is not going to take the battery close to the expected cycles within the warranty period. The EV market in Australia has a lot of competition right now, so brands are likely to seek every advantage they can get, and expect clarity by as early as July 2025. With such a high take-up of home solar, Australia could play a significant role in the deployment of V2G globally. It gets complex and would be long, so I will leave the crunching of numbers for another video, but the Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO, has already forecast that home solar could account for 50% of electrical generation by 2050, and South Australia has already reached 23% in 2023. All this is without accounting for any impact from V2G. I will crunch those numbers, and I feel home solar combined with V2G could single-handedly solve Australia's new power generation needs between now and 2030 if politicians and fossil fuel companies would not just allow it, but support it. V2G won't reduce energy prices, but it can dramatically reduce the amount you need to buy. And that hurts energy companies and the economy. Anytime consumers save money, it takes money out of the economy. And there can be a pushback from politicians. COVID increased work from home, and politicians responded that less spent on commuting and consumption outside the home damages the economy. Better to have a consumer who buys coffee at a cafe and wastes hours per day commuting than one that can use the time saved and save on fuel and public transport and makes their own coffee. 23% of power in South Australia already being from home solar means already 23% of power bills no longer contribute to the numbers for the economy. The dollars at risk, if that percentage grows, is sufficient incentive for lobby groups to be busy trying to ensure government policy is for everyone to live in denser housing, unsuitable for rooftop solar, even in a country with all the space of Australia. The message is what's needed is more gas for power generators, because more gas supply will lower prices, and even though Australians pay world pricing to these majority foreign-owned gas companies, surely increasing the amount of world gas that comes from Australia to beyond the current 10% will lower global gas prices and thus the prices paid by Australians. Or is it all about Australia collecting lower resource taxes than any other major supply country, which means companies make more on Australian gas? Yes, there will be steps to protect fossil fuel company revenues. And with reduced consumers paying, prices may rise for those left behind. Perhaps another case of social injustice, but just giving in and paying is not a solution. V2G can seriously impact the economics of owning an EV, or at least an EV hybrid, and that could dramatically accelerate uptake. On the flip side, it gives fossil fuel companies an even bigger reason to fight, and while this could save consumers money, that takes money out of the economy, and governments generally favour the economy over saving money for consumers. This means it could turn into a very complex political problem that will be impacted by whatever happens to global temperatures over the next few years. And both of those topics, the government and the temperatures, will be discussed in videos to be linked below. A future where saving on power requires not just solar, but also batteries, and owning an EV or EV hybrid is the lowest cost way to buy batteries, looks highly likely.